Welcome to this episode of the Best Hopes podcast. I am Adam Frower.
And I'm Cecil Walker.
And today we're going to go back to another component of hope. And we're going to draw on something that we mentioned way back in episode 5 of season 1. And that episode was about depending or being dependent on something. And let me just give you a little bit of context about why we're going to put it in here. So we mentioned before that we kind of broke down the different components of hope, and we put some of them as present tense options and we put some as future tense options. We talked about how that really overlapped with internal traits versus external things. And so we've spent the last couple of episodes on awaiting, which is a present tense internal component. And dependence is another one of those internal present tense components of hope. And so back in that first episode that we did about dependence, one of the things that kind of stood out to me that I want to kind of come back to and, milk Cecil for all of his genius is we said, I'll just go back and read exactly what we said.
Okay.
It says, having hope as something that you can depend on is really something that we can put our trust in, something that's kind of steady, a force out there, something that's holding stable that can be consistently relied on. And in that episode, we kind of really talked about like this external thing that you can rely on, that you can put this internal thing that you've got in trust in that external thing. And so we talked a lot about kind of that dynamic. But one of the things that I think needs additional clarification, and this is where I get to just start bombarding you with questions, so be prepared.
Good luck. I don't know what you're going to get out of it.
Is how do you determine, how do you decide, okay, that thing out there is worth putting my internal trust in? How do I know that that thing out there is, like we said, steady? It's a force that's out there. It's stable. It's something that doesn't really move. I can depend on that. So I'm putting my trust in that thing. How do you know? How do you know that you're putting your trust, you're putting this internal thing you've got in something worthwhile out there?
As usual, that's a big question. And I think it potentially has a few different angles of how someone could answer that. And maybe different people can answer in different contexts from different ways. One angle I potentially see is a sense of trust being a bit overlapping in its definition with valuing something. I could see that being why someone would put their dependence on, something external, like a family member, someone you're saying, I'm going to depend on this person for this outcome or for this assistance in getting me to a certain place or for this support or for this comfort or for whatever. And I think you would put that dependence on that person because you value that person. You value their input, you value their ability, maybe their stability, maybe they've proven that they can be depended on. But even if there's room for doubt, I guess, in that person, you still say, because I care or because I love that person, before I value this person and I value this relationship, I'm willing to give this anyway. I'm willing to put dependence on them because that also says something about my relationship to them. That says something about what I think about them or what I think about us. So I don't think that's specific to people, but I think just in general, that's one angle of why someone might potentially see that's a place, a thing, a person I can, put a bunch of this dependence on. I can say that that's stable enough. That's something enough that I'm willing to do that for. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but that's just the first thing that came to mind for me.
Yeah, it does make sense. I'm going to comment on it, and then I have another question. You made me think of something else. But one of the things that I really appreciate about what you said is there's almost this like evidence, I guess two components of what you just mentioned. One is there's evidence that in this case, this person is someone that is worthy of my trust.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like I've experimented putting a little bit of trust in them. They've followed through. I can now depend on that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like you were describing that dependence increases. You didn't say any of this. I read all of this into what you were saying.
I'll take credit for whatever you're about to give me, sure.
But like dependence increases like incrementally,
mm-hmm.
that as I give you more trust, then you follow through.
Yeah.
And I realize, oh, my trust was well-founded. And so now I can depend on that. It's
mm-hmm.
almost like, because there's a lot of history in you following through, I can depend on your future following through.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that like incremental increase is something that I pulled out of that. But also, you tied it to meaning making. You said this relationship is an important relationship to me. It means something to
mm-hmm.
me. And so I want to put trust into it. So it's almost like you've balanced it. It means something. And there's evidence that says I can trust this meaningful thing.
Mm-hmm.
So the question that came to my mind is, and I think this is going back and connecting to hope, is how does meaning making translate to, I don't know how to phrase this question except for meaningful hope? But a lot of times in the podcast, we've made a distinction between like just empty hope of like,
mm-hmm.
I hope this thing happens. And you're insinuating there's something meaningful in this relationship, which I think will then broaden to other things in a bit. But there's something meaningful about this relationship. And so it is worth putting hope in.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know if it's worth putting hope in versus I'm just empty-handedly throwing hope at this thing?
Well, something else we've alluded to a few times is that it's not really always concretely about the outcome, like a guarantee that I'm going to get the thing that I set out to say I really wanted. I think that often happens, especially when people find themselves leaning on a lot of these things that we're talking about, leaning on faith and hopefulness and confidence and awaiting and like all these kinds of things. But I think the real true gain of a lot of this stuff that we're talking about isn't that, you're going to win the lottery or you're going to get that thing in the end, that real concrete thing that you wanted. I think it's more of you're going to be the kind of person, one, that you want to be, but also two, that can experience this process of you moving forward in a much more satisfying way, in a much more desirable way, in a much more effective way. And so that's relevant to your question, because in a way, the meaning making happens where you're saying this relationship or this thing, whatever I'm putting my depending on, means something to me, and I'm engaging with that meaning / maybe even enhancing that meaning by saying I'm going to trust it. I'm going to lean on this. I'm going to put what I'm hoping for onto this thing. And it's not about that thing literally paying out. That obviously would be nice and would probably be a big part of the hope. But it's also about that action itself. And it's about the person you're being, the version of yourself you're living as, through engaging in that kind of a way. I think of it kind of like how, you have children, so you want to trust your children. And so when you see opportunities to trust your children, even if they might make this mistake, or the story they're spinning seems a little fishy, they might not be telling the full truth here, you still want to create the scenario of, I'm giving you this trust, and let's see where the trust goes. Let's see what you do with that. And I think in an instance like that, it's saying that this process is much more valuable than what literally is going to happen. I could cut, take a shortcut around all of this and just say, here's what I'm pretty sure I think you're going to do, or what I really think you're saying and thinking right now. But, you want to invest in the process. You want to put another brick in your relationship with your child. You want to, have the journey itself work its way out, rather than trying to very literally say, no, let's just cut to the chase. Here's the thing. And going straight to that, rather than, creating the meaning that happens when you place that dependence on, that trust on that person, that relationship.
I'm going to do my best to kind of make this point. But in the piece that you said last time, you said it's really guided by what you value, that the meaning making comes back to kind of what you value. And it's interesting because as I went back to kind of all of these synonyms that we have classified as internal synonyms or present tense synonyms, I think we could link each of them back to what are my values? Like, I'm awaiting something in particular because I value that thing, or I hope that this outcome will occur, and I value that. So it's worth waiting for. It's worth working for. It's worth putting effort toward. In this case, I can put my trust in this thing. I can depend on this thing because I value this kind of a relationship. And it goes on, like, I ruminate about these things because I value it. Another one of them is virtue. It's I see this as virtuous. I see this as something worth having or pursuing, or a belief or a desire. Those are others, right? So it's like, I believe in this thing because I value this thing. I desire this because I think it would be useful for me. So I think that you use the word of value, and I think that is kind of an umbrella thing that for all of these present tense internal synonyms of hope, it regularly does come back to, what do you value? And so then in this last comment that you made, I think there's a really important thing there where you're saying, you used an example of you're trying to develop a certain kind of a relationship. And I think that again, you connect those things. I value this kind of a relationship. So I'm working to develop this relationship. So I depend on my kid in the example that you gave. I say, okay, I'm going to let you do something, right? I'm thinking about my middle kid because he just got his driver's license and it is petrifying.
I bet it is.
You know that he's worked all the things, logically he knows all the rules of the road. But when you actually put him in that vehicle, and obviously his life is invaluable, but there is a lot of expense that he's driving around, and you're thinking, okay, like, is the expense worth trust? Should I depend on his ability? What's more important? Depending on him and developing a relationship where he knows that I trust him, that I depend on him, that I value him, or this, multi-$1,000 vehicle that he is driving around? Which one of those things is more important? And the balance is delicate. But I think that what you're getting at with this dependence is, I can put a lot of forethought into, where do I place value? Do I place value on the car, or do I place value on helping him become somebody who's confident, helping him to become somebody who can accomplish something really difficult? And so, again, I think at times that balance like teeters one way or the other. We had a very explicit conversation around, like, you can't drive this car to the school parking lot because I trust you, but I don't trust all of those other heathens that you go to school with. And so there's a balance. I value trusting him, but I also value safety. And so I think where we decide to place our dependence changes. I'll let him drive a lot of places. He has worked up to now he drives to the school parking lot, which again is a terrifying prospect every single day. But there was extra effort that we had to put in. And so he hated it, but like, I would ride with him to school in the morning to see, like, how does he maneuver chaos?
Mm-hmm.
And then after school, my older daughter, who's been driving for several years, she would go and sit in the car and let him drive home so she could evaluate, like, how are you maneuvering chaos? And so I think, again, we let him do it, but we put extra parameters around. And I think that's like what we were talking about before, is like there's incremental trust that can be built up. And by the end of his high school career, I'm sure we're just going to send him off to school and not think about the fact that he's driving to pandemonium. But I think that example highlights that incremental trust, but it also highlights there's a development of trust that I'm going to put in, but also that forethought of like, what's more important? That relation, like you mentioned, putting a brick into the relationship or protecting a valuable car. And I think I really like that example because it shows dependence isn't just all or nothing.
Right. Yeah. I think those details exemplify that really perfectly. How this is it's the act itself somehow that invests meaning, creates meaning, and allows you to even get to enjoy and experience the meaning that's happening there. And it's less about, because if you really wanted the practicality of absolute safety, he could never leave home. He doesn't have to have a driver's license. He doesn't have to go to public school. You could just kind of keep him trapped at home. But this is obviously about more than that there's value in the relationship itself. There's value in the handing over of trust. You want him to grow up to be a certain kind of a person. You want your relationship with him to be a certain kind of a way. So yeah, I think what you described perfectly shows the placement of that value, the placement of I'm depending on you to be this kind of a way, giving that trust. There is something meaningful in that in and of itself. And that kind of, as you were speaking, that like leaned me over into another one of the angles that I was picturing when you first asked this initial question of how do you decide what to depend on? And one part of me, I wasn't even sure of how the words would come out. One part of me feels like sometimes it's like I have to depend on that thing, either out of like, I really need it to work out, or to get where I'm trying to go, this is the step that I have to take. And I think that's relevant to, what you just described. If you want to have a certain kind of relationship long-term with your children, these are the certain kind of steps that you have to take. You could lock them in their room for 18 years, sliding them meals and textbooks every now and then. And that would get the job done. They would be technically raised, alive, safe, and educated somewhat. But if you want them to feel like they're in a loving, trusting relationship, that they can have some type of healthy, ongoing, expressive relationship with you, that they can feel happy and comfortable, like all these things, it's like, well, then there are some steps that I have to take. I have to give this kind of trust. I have to give this type of dependence, even if it's hard. And I think the same would apply in lots of other examples of someone having to put their hope through this depending kind of an action.
Yeah, one of the things that I appreciate about that is you also mentioned before, like, what version of myself do I want to be? And I think that this kind of gets back to that a bit, where it requires some forethought to say, okay, I want to be such and such type of person. So what does that mean about what I should put my trust in? Who should I depend on? What should I depend on? We all kind of do that in politics, right? We're not the ones who are making the laws. We're not the ones who are enforcing the laws. We're at some point we have to say, okay, I'm going to put my trust in such and such a person, and I'm going to hope that they go and do their job and create laws, do things that I value. So I think that's an example of where we put our dependence on somebody else to do things on our behalf. But I also think, like in the example you were using with relationships, I have to be conscientious of what kind of dad do I want to be.
Right.
I want my kids to, value me. I want my kids to depend on me. I want my kids to love me. I want us to be able to have an open kind of interaction with one another where we can trust each other. I have to know that going into it,
Mm-hmm.
because that's going to influence my decisions. Going back to this driving, every ounce of my natural self is like, do not let that kid get into that car
Mm-hmm.
and drive somewhere. It's not safe. He could get hurt. He could hurt somebody else. Like, every logical thing is saying bad idea. But it's I want him to become this kind of a person. I want him to know that I can trust him.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the things that then push it over the edge, and like, even though this is a scary prospect, I'm gonna let you take
Mm-hmm.
this scary step. And I think you move that into other types of relationships, like intimate relationships, right? We can either be guarded. We can either like show up as nervous or non-confrontational, or like we can show up as that version of ourselves, and we could be in a relationship with somebody else. But when we're in a really flourishing relationship, we're really saying the value of the relationship is more important than what I particularly want. This is the whole, like, do you squeeze the toothpaste in the middle or at the end, right? If you say, I want to show up as a loving partner, then I don't care where they squeeze the toothpaste. I go buy them a tube of toothpaste and say, squeeze it wherever you want to squeeze it. That conveys to them, I love you, I care about you, and it doesn't matter these small little things. So knowing what kind of person I want to be informs how I trust or how I depend on somebody else. I think we oftentimes assume that I have to know what's on the other side in order to trust it. And I think in some sense, I have influence over what shows up on the other side.
Yeah. What's so interesting about that? I know we're always usually very forward looking in these conversations about hope, but as you were speaking, that made me think of the ways that people oftentimes, in just being so committed to being a certain type of a person or valuing certain types of things, this can be very ingrained, I think, in people oftentimes, especially if they've made these kinds of decisions somewhere in their past. And people might not even notice all the things that they do where they're making these choices of, I used the language earlier of, I have to do this. Like, this is just what I have to do. I don't know if it felt like that for you by the time you get to your third child, where it's like, well, these are the steps I'm supposed to do, and I just do them, and it doesn't even have to feel like a negotiation. I don't know, kids seem hard. So maybe every step you have to think.
Every kid is totally different.
Yeah.
So what worked with the first one is not going to work on the third one.
But I'm thinking of when people, like, I remember there was an example that someone brought to one of the trainings that we were doing where they said they had a client who was taking care of a family member or something like that, even though they had a really difficult relationship with that family member, and that it made them really unhappy to have that person there, and they were all depressed and didn't know what to do. And it just seemed like the situation was hopeless. And how do you move this forward? How do you take an angle that's somehow constructive on this? And what my ears heard in that was they're so committed to being whatever kind of person that they're saying they need to be or naturally are or would like to be. And that kind of person can't say no to taking care of this family member, can't say no to this person living with them, even at whatever huge burden it costs them. They're so committed to that and so much that person that it doesn't even strike them as like, I can't do that. I can't, it's not an option to say no. Their mind is thinking, oh, this is really hard. I got to figure out a way to still get my life to be the way I want it to be while I'm dealing with this thing. And it's not crossing their mind that I could dump this problem and just go live my life. I could go be happy. And I think that has to be a form of trust. That's like I have to make this decision. Somehow, one way or another, it's better, it's more valuable, it's the right thing to do. I think I want to go this path of seeing how things play out, given I make this decision, rather than me choosing some other path, some other decision. And that to me sounds like dependence too. It's like, I'm depending on this working out. I don't know if it's, a karma thing, like a moral thing, and I do the right thing, right things come my way, Or if it's, I just want to live as this kind of a person, so I'm depending on this kind of a person being able to navigate the things that come up. But either way, I think that's dependence too. That's exactly what I was saying earlier with this, like, you have to take these steps in order to get to be the kind of person you want to be or get to the place that you want to get.
Yeah, what's interesting is as you're talking, I think my own perception of what this means is shifting a bit.
Oh.
Because I was kind of always thinking about dependence as I put my dependence on something outside of me. I depend on something out there. And as you're talking, and even in the example of like from kid number 1 to kid number 3, what came to my mind is I am depending on being a certain type of person. I'm depending on me. I'm making choices based on what I value.
Mm-hmm.
I'm making choices based on the meaning making that I create. It's not necessarily something out there. And so I think about it like, well, my value as a parent is to raise independent people.
Yeah.
Now, the way that the first child responds to independence will be a bit different. So the ins and outs, the day-to-day things might look different, right? I might just say, hey, go try this thing, and they go try it. And so their own independence I have fostered. With kid number 3, it might be like, I'm really reluctant to try this new thing. And so because I value this thing, because I'm depending on this characteristic or this belief system of you should be an independent person, then maybe I'm going to give them an alternative option, or maybe I'm going to talk to them a bit and be like, well, how come you're so nervous? Or why don't you want to try this new thing? So the outward actions might look different, but it's really because I'm depending on this belief of I want them to be independent, which brings it back to, again, kind of this internal, we've kind of described this as an internal versus an external component of hope. And we originally put this dependence as an internal thing. And I think it really does, we're dependent on our own meaning making. We're dependent on our own values. We're dependent, and those can be informed by external things. Mm-hmm. Some examples, again, we use politics, right? Like I put my dependence on somebody else, but really it's because I value such and such, and I think that person's going to do it. In a faith-based system, I might say I trust in God. And so I put my faith in God, but really what it comes down to is I behave in a way, I depend on myself, I trust myself, I move forward because I value that relationship with God. And so I'm going to behave as though God's going to follow through. I don't have any control over if God follows through or not, but I believe in what I value. I believe in my own meaning-making system, and so I proceed as though that will occur. And so I think that it's a fine balance, but I think as you're talking, my shift is this dependence is really regularly an internal dependence.
Yeah.
It's a personal dependence. I believe in me, I value me, I trust in me, so I'm going to move forward as though things will proceed in the way that I'm hoping or expecting that they will.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I wasn't really expecting this to unravel in this kind of a way, but I can very well see how it can hardly be a very finite, singular thing when you put your dependence on something, because like you're saying, it's almost like that can be very well translated into a dependence you're putting on yourself, on a certain person that you're being, or on your decision-making abilities or whatever. It's like one action is a mirroring of several placements of dependences, potentially all at the same time.
Yeah. Anything else that we need to make sure to get to? You said you had several different ways that you might answer, so I didn't want to make sure that we...
I feel like we kind of like touched on lots of different angles, and I didn't even have all the words for it. So actually, I feel like we had a very saturated conversation about it. I wasn't even expecting some of that stuff.
Yeah, one of the things, I guess just one final thing that kind of strikes me, and I think that this is a balance that we play often, is that this is an individual characteristic, but because we're human, because we're relational, because we, are interrelational, oftentimes our internal characteristics then play out interpersonally. And I think dependence is a real good example of that, where I have to know myself. I have to know what I want out of life. I have to know what kind of person I want to be. And then I have to really depend on that. I have to move forward, trusting that. But at the same time, because we're interpersonal, I have to be able to trust a partner. I have to be able to trust coworkers. I have to be able to trust friends. I have to depend on them in order to achieve the maximum amount that I can achieve. Some might go as far as to say, again, like I need to trust in God, or I need to trust in a higher power, or I need to trust in the universe. There's a give and a take. Unless I show up in those relationships as the best version of myself, I'm not going to get the best out of those relationships. If I don't throw complete dependence out there in a relationship, I'm not going to be completely depended on either. And so I think it's a real fine balance of an individual thing versus a connection thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. This was a good one.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, hopefully you had some new thoughts like we had new thoughts throughout this process. We would love to hear about your thoughts about how hope plays out through dependence. Let us know what you're thinking. If you know somebody who could benefit from this conversation, please share this conversation with them. We would really appreciate it. Until then, go find ways to be meaningfully dependent.